In a quiet town where kindness often goes unnoticed, one selfless act sets off a chain of events no one could have imagined. When Frank, a modest, grease-stained mechanic with a heart of gold, spots a young boy struggling with a broken wheelchair, he doesn't hesitate. He fixes it for free, expecting nothing in return. But the very next day, a sonic boom shatters the morning calm. A sleek jet descends onto the town's forgotten airstrip, and out steps a woman in a pilot suit. Eli's mother, Clara. She's no ordinary parent. She's a top-tier aerospace engineer with secrets the military can't even whisper about. Clara's arrival is more than a thank you. It's a reckoning of past promises and present miracles. What begins as a simple repair transforms into a tale of second chances, futuristic inventions, and a community witnessing greatness born from humility. As Clara invites Frank into a world of jets, labs, and life-changing innovation, he realizes that helping one boy may lead to helping millions. What if the kindest thing you ever did came back not as a thank you card, but as a jet landing in your front yard? It was one of those mornings that whispered promises of nothing extraordinary. The sun was half asleep, hiding behind a patchy layer of clouds that painted the sky a dull gray. The town of Millbridge woke slowly, its streets humming with the usual routines. Coffee brewing in diners, dogs barking at delivery vans, and tired shopkeepers rolling open their metal shutters. Frank Turner stood at the edge of his auto repair shop, a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand, the other scratching his head through salt and pepper hair. The garage was modest, paint peeling from the wooden sign that read Turner's Auto and Tire, but clean and well kept. The kind of place where everyone in town brought their cars, not just for repairs, but for the familiarity of Frank's honesty and his habit of fixing more than he charged for. That's when he saw him, a boy, maybe 10, no older, pushing himself up the sidewalk in a worn-down wheelchair. His tiny hands gripped the wheels with more strength than a body that size should have. One wheel wobbled, jerking against the concrete every few turns. The boy's face was focused but strained, lips pressed together in a tight line. His backpack dragged on one side, and he looked like he had been traveling for a while. Frank narrowed his eyes and stepped forward, setting the coffee on the hood of a car parked outside. "Hey there, champ," he called gently. "Need a hand?" The boy stopped, chest heaving slightly. He looked up, blinking behind thick glasses. "I'm okay," he replied quickly, too quickly, like he'd been taught not to ask for help. Frank walked over anyway, crouching beside the chair. "Looks like that wheel's about to walk off the job. Mind if I take a peek?" There was hesitation in the boy's eyes. Worry, pride, fear, all tangled into a child's need to be strong. But eventually, he nodded. "Okay." Frank smiled. "Name's Frank. What's yours?" "Eli." "Well, Eli, let's see what we can do for this stubborn wheel of yours." Frank gently examined the wheelchair. One wheel was clearly loose, the axle worn down, a few screws missing. He noticed makeshift repairs, twist ties and duct tape holding parts together like a battlefield patch job. This wasn't the work of a careless kid. It was the work of someone who had no other option. "Tell you what," Frank said, standing up and brushing his hands off on his overalls. "Let me take it inside. I'll have it fixed up in no time." Eli's eyes widened. I don't have money." Frank grinned. "Didn't ask for any. First fix is on the house. Call it a trade. You tell me your favorite comic book, and I'll tell you mine." Eli smiled for the first time. Okay, deal. Frank wheeled the chair into the garage and helped Eli onto a rolling stool while he got to work. As he tightened bolts, replaced bearings, and aligned the frame, Eli talked about his favorite superhero, Skyhawk, a jet-powered vigilante who could fly faster than sound and saved people nobody else cared about. Frank listened closely, nodding, chuckling at the boy's detailed descriptions. Skyhawk, huh? I like that. Mine's more old school, Captain Torque. Doesn't fly, but that guy could fix anything. They shared a laugh. By the time Frank finished, the chair looked and felt almost brand new. He even added a coat of industrial paint to match Skyhawk's signature blue and silver. Eli tested it, his eyes lighting up as the wheels spun smoothly beneath him. It's perfect, he whispered. Frank leaned against the workbench, wiping grease from his hands. Glad you like it. Now go save the world, Skyhawk. Eli looked at him, serious now. Thank you, Mr. Frank, really. The boy rolled out of the garage, stronger, faster, freer. Frank stood there for a long moment, watching the silhouette shrink down the sidewalk. He hadn't done much, really, just a quick fix. But the way Eli had looked at him like he'd been handed wings, that stuck with him. He shook his head, picked up his coffee, and returned to the rhythm of the wrench and socket. Just another morning, he thought. But it wasn't. Tomorrow the sky over Millbridge would thunder with something far beyond ordinary. Frank Turner had seen his fair share of broken things, cracked bumpers, seized engines, twisted axles, but nothing rattled him more than that wheelchair. The way it had been patched together told a story louder than any words Eli could have said. Someone, somewhere, was doing their best with almost nothing. He didn't ask questions. Frank was never one to pry. People had pride, and pride was worth more than gold to some. He just fixed things, handed them back, and let the silence do its job. But Eli stayed in his mind all day. He thought about the boy's quiet resolve, the glint of awe in his eyes when the wheelchair rolled smooth and clean for the first time in who knows how long. That look did something to Frank, reached past the calluses and into something softer he hadn't felt since his own daughter was Eli's age. He tried to shake it off, but later that evening, after closing up shop, he caught himself checking the front door more than once. Part of him expected the boy to return. Another part worried he wouldn't. The next morning, Frank opened his garage early. The chill hadn't lifted from the air yet, but he wanted to be ready in case Eli came by again. Maybe to say thanks, maybe for another quick fix. He didn't come. By noon, Frank had nearly convinced himself it was over, that he'd done a good deed, and that was that. But a small part of him hoped to see that hopeful little face again. Then the knock came, not at the door. In the sky. A rumble rolled overhead, deep, powerful wrong somehow for this quiet town. Frank stepped outside and looked up. It wasn't thunder. It was too clean, too fast. He saw it, a blur of silver and cobalt, streaking through the clouds before descending toward Millbridge Airstrip. Frank started, stunned. The airstrip hadn't seen anything fancier than crop dusters in 20 years. The townsfolk noticed too. Phones came out, necks craned. Everyone looked up, wide-eyed, whispering. And Frank felt it in his gut. This wasn't just a coincidence. The jet was something out of a science fiction movie. Sleek, impossibly smooth, with sweeping wings and a faint shimmer of blue under the sunlight. It touched down like a feather, not even stirring the dust on the old airstrip. Frank was already halfway there, walking on instinct. A crowd had gathered at the chain-link fence that surrounded the airstrip. Sheriff Daniels stood near the gate, scratching his head beneath his hat. "Frank," he muttered as the mechanic joined him, "you know what the hell this is?" "Nope," Frank said, eyes never leaving the jet. "But I think I'm about to find out." The cockpit opened with a hydraulic hiss, and a figure climbed down. She stood tall in her flight suit, black and silver with an unfamiliar insignia on the shoulder. Her helmet came off, revealing a striking woman in her late 30s, high cheekbones, sharp eyes, and an expression both tired and determined. Her ponytail was windswept, but her walk was purposeful. Then Eli appeared, racing toward the crowd in his newly repaired wheelchair. Frank's heart jumped. The woman knelt as Eli wheeled into her arms. She held him tightly, whispering something no one could hear. The crowd watched in silence. There was something sacred in that reunion. Then she stood, still holding Eli, and her eyes found Frank. Without a word, she walked straight toward him. "You must be Frank Turner," she said. He nodded slowly. "That's me." "I'm Clara," she said, "Eli's mother." Frank glanced at the boy, who was now smiling from ear to ear. "He's a good kid." "I know," Clara replied. "He told me everything." Frank chuckled. "Wasn't much, just tightened a few bolts." Clara smiled, not politely but deeply, like she knew something the rest didn't. "To you, maybe. To us. You gave him back a piece of his freedom, a piece of his childhood." Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I'm here." She reached into her flight jacket and pulled out a card, black, embossed. No company logo, just a number and a symbol he didn't recognize. "I work in aerospace, defense mostly, but we're building something bigger, something that could use someone like you." Frank took the card slowly. "Are you serious?" "I bought a jet, didn't I?" she said, grinning. He looked down at the card again, then at Eli, who was watching him like he was already flying. Frank exhaled. "What exactly are you building?" Clara's eyes gleamed. "A future where no kid like Eli has to wait to be fixed. A world where mobility isn't a privilege, it's a right. You built the beginning of that in your garage." Frank didn't know what to say. For once, the mechanic who always had the right wrench or the right word was speechless. Clara reached out and shook his hand. "Let's talk. Tomorrow?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, tomorrow." As she walked away, Frank looked down at the card again. His hands, stained with oil and years of hard work, trembled slightly, and for the first time in decades he wondered if maybe, just maybe, his life was about to take off. Frank sat in his kitchen that night, the black card still resting on the table like it was ticking. He hadn't called the number, not yet. Instead, he stared at it between sips of his lukewarm coffee, his fingers drumming lightly on the tabletop. Outside, Millbridge was quiet. Too quiet for a man whose life had just been visited by a jet and a woman who looked like she stepped out of NASA. He didn't regret fixing Eli's wheelchair, never had, but now there was a ripple, a disturbance in the still pond of his routine. Clara had brought something with her, something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The next morning the shop buzzed with more than engines. Customers came in under the guise of oil changes, but everyone wanted to talk about the jet. "Did you see her land?" "What kind of tech is that?" "Heard she was CIA or something." Frank just nodded, gave vague answers, and kept working. By late morning, Clara walked into the garage again, this time without the flight suit. She wore jeans, a worn leather jacket, and sunglasses that made her look like a movie star lost in the countryside. Frank looked up from under a car hood. Didn't expect a return visit so soon. Clara smiled. I owed you a proper thank you, and Eli wanted to see you. The boy rolled in behind her, already in the improved wheelchair, zooming around like he had wings. Mr. Frank, watch this. He spun in a clean circle, giggling. Frank chuckled. You're going to burn rubber on those tires, kiddo. Clara leaned against the wall, watching them. He hasn't smiled like that in months. Frank shrugged. Like I said, wasn't a big deal. It was, she said firmly. There was a silence between them then, not awkward, just full, like neither wanted to disturb the moment. Frank turned back to his workbench. Well, if you're here to pay me back, don't bother. That fix was free of charge. Clara stepped closer. I didn't come to pay you in money. He glanced sideways. Then what? She pulled out a folder, slim, black, and heavy with implication. Inside were blueprints, schematics, and images of machines that didn't exist yet. Not publicly. Frank flipped through them slowly. Jet-powered mobility systems, exoskeleton chairs, autonomous flight pods. These aren't just concepts, Clara said. We're already prototyping, but we need people who understand how to fix real things, not just theory, craft. Frank exhaled slowly. Why me? Because when a kid's wheel falls off, you don't run diagnostics. You grab a wrench and give a damn. He looked down at the folder, then back at her. Still not asking for money. Clara smirked. Number, I'm offering you a seat at the table, a chance to build something that matters. Frank closed the folder. You sure I won't just slow your jet down? She smiled. You're the guy who made my kid feel like a superhero. You're already flying. By the time Clara and Eli left that day, the atmosphere in the garage had changed. Not just the air, everything, like the place had inhaled a future it wasn't quite ready for but couldn't resist. Frank watched them go, Clara pushing the wheelchair this time as Eli chattered about how fast he thought the jet could go. Frank smiled. He hadn't realized until now how badly he'd needed that smile. Eli's, sure, but also his own. The kind that doesn't just tug the corners of your mouth, it anchors something inside you. That evening he stayed late in the garage. Not working, just thinking. He pulled out his old drafting table from the corner, blew the dust off, set Clara's folder down beside his notepad, and began sketching, not because he had to, because he wanted to. Wheels that hovered, motors that adapted, even wild ideas like retractable wings for rough terrain. It was childlike, exhilarating. Eli had given him something too, permission to imagine again. The next day, Eli and Clara returned, but this time with cookies and hand-drawn thank you cards. Eli's had a crayon drawing of a mechanic with goggles and a wrench, flying a jet with flames shooting out the back. Frank laughed out loud. You got me flying a jet, huh? Eli nodded. You're in Skyhawk's crew now. Clara looked at the drawing, then at Frank. We're serious about that offer. You can say no, but we hope you won't. Frank's smile softened into something deeper. He looked down at Eli's card, then at the folder again. 2 days ago, he was fixing brake pads. Now he was holding the blueprints to the future, painted in crayon and ambition. Let's talk, he said. about what comes next. Long before jets and blueprints, Clara Rivera had her feet firmly planted on the ground, one hand on a stroller, the other gripping the edge of exhaustion. Life as a single mother had never been the plan, but plans were a luxury Clara hadn't had in a long time. Eli came into the world too early, his cries thin and his legs too weak. Doctors spoke in hushed tones at first, words like neurological, mobility impairment, lifelong management. Clara heard everyone, but what echoed loudest was her own promise, whispered into Eli's incubator during those fragile first days. "I'll carry you until you fly." She meant it, and in every way that counted. Clara never put him down. They lived frugally, studio apartments, second-hand everything. Every extra penny went to medical bills, adaptive equipment, and Eli's education. Clara worked impossible shifts, first as an aviation intern during the day, then slinging tables at night. But she had a mind for machines. By 30, she was designing propulsion systems for defense contractors. She rose fast, not just because she was brilliant, but because she never stopped moving, never stopped imagining a world where Eli wouldn't just be taken care of, he'd thrive. Her colleagues respected her, even feared her intensity. What they didn't know was that every gear she turned, every circuit she rewired was a mother's quiet battle cry. At night, after the labs dimmed and the meetings ended, Clara would sit beside Eli's bed and work. Not just her job, but herself. Learning, coding, designing. She'd sketch out ideas she couldn't tell anyone about. Small exo-drivers for wheelchairs, micro-turbines light enough for personal flight, neural-linked controls. They laughed in her early days when she called them mobility wings. But she never stopped drawing them, because somewhere out there she knew the world didn't need another drone system. It needed freedom, speed, a new language for mobility. And it needed to start with Eli. The night after meeting Frank, Clara sat at the end of the hotel bed. Eli curled beside her, half asleep. The town of Millbridge whispered beyond the window, quiet streets and soft porch lights that made it feel like time had slowed just for them. She traced the outline of Eli's shoulder, marveling at how much he'd grown, how much he'd endured. There was strength in his silence, unspoken resilience. He hadn't complained once about the broken wheelchair, hadn't cried when the wheel jammed on the uneven sidewalk, just pushed forward. She thought of her own journey, how many miles she'd walked alone, how many doors she'd knocked on, begging for support or insight or simply space to dream. Most had closed, some had cracked open, but no one had ever opened their door with the same sincerity as Frank Turner, a small-town mechanic who didn't blink before helping a stranger's child. That was rare. Clara opened her laptop and tapped into her encrypted company database, Project ADA, Adaptive Dynamic Aviation. Her secret initiative was nearing prototype stage. Her team still didn't know it was inspired by Eli. They thought it was just the next evolution of combat support mobility. They were wrong. It was her promise, etched in metal, fueled by science, driven by love. She clicked through the designs and hovered over one particular diagram, a hybrid wheelchair frame with hoverlift capabilities compact enough for home use, powerful enough to lift off vertically. She smiled and whispered, "Soon, baby." Eli stirred beside her. "Mom?" "I'm here," she said softly, brushing his hair back. "Did you mean it when you said I could fly one day?" Clara's breath caught. "I meant every word. He smiled and drifted back to sleep. Clara closed the laptop, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she will meet Frank again, not just to thank him, but to offer him a seat at the table. She remembered her promise, and now it was time to keep it. Frank stood in the garage, polishing the final coat of silver paint on the wheelchair. He'd stayed up half the night, not because he had to, but because something in him wouldn't let it go unfinished. He'd reinforced the chassis, replaced the bearings with high-speed grade ones, even added rubberized hand rims for better grip. But what made him grin the most was the finishing touch. He'd mounted a pair of small, non-functional wings at the back, shaped from old aluminum side panels, Skyhawk style. It looked like something out of a comic book now, sleek, metallic, fast even when standing still. When Eli and Clara returned, Frank wheeled the chair out like it was a trophy. Eli gasped, "Whoa!" Clara covered her mouth. Her eyes watered, but she blinked the tears back. "Frank." He held up a hand. "No tears, lady. I already cried once building this thing. Don't make me go soft twice." Eli raced over and practically dove into the chair. The wheels rolled smoother than ever. The frame glided, turning on a dime. "I can do spins now," Eli laughed, executing a perfect 360 degrees. Clara stepped closer. "You didn't just fix it, you transformed it." Frank shrugged, trying to play it off. "Sometimes things come in busted so bad, you gotta make 'em better than new. Besides," he winked at Eli, "Skyhawk deserves his ride." Eli looked up at him, and in that look was something pure, a gratitude so deep it made the air feel heavier. "I'll take care of it," Eli whispered. "Promise." Frank knelt. "Nah, kid, it's gonna take care of you." And just like that, a boy with broken wheels became a superhero with wings. In small towns like Millbridge, news didn't travel, it flew. By noon, the day after Clara's jet landed, every corner of town was buzzing. The diner, the post office, even the checkout line at the general store. Everywhere you went, someone was talking about the jet, the pilot lady, and the boy with the rocket wheelchair. At Ruth's Cafe, the town's unofficial headquarters of gossip and hash browns, the story had already evolved. One version had Clara working for NASA, scouting small towns for gifted children like Eli. Another insisted she was ex-military, running a covert mission under the government's nose. A particularly dramatic theory had her as a time-traveling mechanic from the future who came back to repay a kindness that would save the world. But the truth, as usual, was more subtle and far more powerful. Sheriff Daniels, normally a man of few words, had taken up a stool near the window and was happily recounting how he'd stood at the airstrip gate just 10 feet away from the biggest damn jet I've ever seen that didn't drop a bomb. Folks listened like they were gathered around a campfire, soaking up every detail. Meanwhile, Frank just tried to keep his head down. He wasn't a spotlight guy. He wasn't used to whispers following him like shadows, or kids pointing at him in the grocery store. But he couldn't escape it. Not after fixing a wheelchair that now had wings and making a boy feel invincible. "Frank the Flyer," someone called from across the street as he stepped out of his shop. He winced. He kept working like usual, patching up a busted muffler, rotating tires, running diagnostics on a truck with a dying alternator. But every customer, no matter how normal their reason for being there, eventually drifted into conversation. "So, she really landed a jet, huh? You think that chair's got rockets?" She military or one of those tech geniuses? Frank would shrug. She's Eli's mom. That's all you need to know. But inside, he felt the pull of something bigger. Clara had left behind more than a thank you and a blueprint. She'd sparked a quiet revolution. Late that afternoon, a reporter from the county newspaper showed up. Young, fresh-faced, and clearly out of his depth, he asked Frank for a quote. Frank stared at him for a moment, then said, "Sometimes you help someone without expecting anything back. And sometimes life decides to thank you with a jet." The quote made the front page the next morning under the headline, "Mechanic fixes boy's wheelchair, gets a jet in return." The town had officially dubbed Frank a legend. Back at the edge of town, Clara sat on the edge of her motel bed, elbows resting on her knees, scrolling through her phone with a familiar mix of focus and fatigue. Her inbox had exploded. Messages from her team, her company's legal department, her project managers. Some congratulated her, some demanded explanations. But one thread kept her attention, a chain of emails under the subject line, ADA Initiative, Phase 2, approval pending. It was happening, faster than expected. She tapped on a message from a senior engineer named Mason. "Clara, if the local guy you mentioned is half as good as you say, bring him in. But corporate's nervous. Civilian integration, mobility tech outside DoD scope, that's high-risk stuff. We need a win here, and fast." She stared at the message, then opened another, a forwarded video clip. It was Eli. Someone in town had recorded him rolling through the streets in his enhanced chair, laughing as the silver-blue frame glinted in the sun. The video had gone viral, hundreds of thousands of views. Freedom in motion. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. She turned to Eli, who was lying on the second bed, reading a Skyhawk comic. "Hey, buddy!" He looked up. "Yeah?" "You remember what I said about flying?" His eyes sparkled. "You said it's not just something you do, it's something you believe in." She smiled. "Exactly." She got up and opened her duffel bag. Inside was her flight suit, folded precisely, next to a sleek black device about the size of a football helmet. She lifted it out. A prototype. "Tomorrow," she said aloud, mostly to herself, "we will show him the future." The sun crested over Millbridge, turning the sky into a canvas of soft oranges and quiet pinks. A breeze whispered through the maple trees, making the flags flutter on porch railings and setting wind chimes into motion. It was the kind of morning that begged for stillness. And then came the thunder, not from clouds, not from a storm, but from above. A jet roared across the sky, slicing through the early calm like a brushstroke of lightning. Birds scattered, dogs barked. People looked up from their porches and morning routines, coffee halfway to their lips. Frank was already outside, eyes on the sky, hand shielding the glare. It was her. The jet made a perfect arc, circled the town once, then slowly descended toward the airstrip. Same as before, but this time, with intention. It was a signal, an invitation. Inside, his phone buzzed. A message from Clara. "Ready to show you something. Meet us at the airstrip. Bring your imagination." Frank stared at the screen, then glanced down at his oil-stained hands. The town might have seen him as a local legend now, but he still felt like the same guy. Fixing broken parts, avoiding cameras, running a one-man shop. But something inside him stirred, a spark he hadn't felt in years. He grabbed his coat, locked the garage, and walked toward the sound of the future. The Millbridge airstrip hadn't seen this much activity in decades. The pavement was cracked in places, weeds creeping through the seams, and the old chain-link fence still leaned slightly from a storm 2 summers ago. But today, it might as well have been a red carpet runway. The jet touched down with surgical precision, gliding across the tarmac like a predator choosing not to pounce. People lined the fence, some still in pajamas, others holding up phones, capturing the moment that made their sleepy town feel like the center of the universe. Inside the jet, Clara went through shutdown procedures with ease. She wore her flight suit, but her face bore none of the military stiffness her outfit implied. Instead, she looked focused, maternal, and just a little bit emotional. Eli sat beside her in a compact high-back travel chair, designed specifically for jet cockpits. He was grinning from ear to ear, barely able to stay in his seat. "You ready to blow their minds?" Clara asked. Eli nodded eagerly. "I want to show Mr. Frank the new wheels." She reached over, ruffling his hair. "He's going to love it." The hatch opened with a hiss, and a ramp extended from the undercarriage. Clara wheeled Eli down, the two of them emerging from the jet like something out of a dream. The crowd was silent for a moment, stunned, until someone let out a low whistle, and then another, until applause rippled across the fence line. Sheriff Daniels tipped his hat. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Frank, standing just outside the fence, caught Clara's eye. She gave him a subtle nod and pushed Eli toward him. Eli's wheels hummed against the ground as he rolled toward Frank, his face lit with excitement and pride. "Mr. Frank, look!" Frank's breath caught in his throat. The chair had changed again, more compact, lightweight, with slim but sturdy wheel rims and sleek modular joints. Embedded LEDs traced soft lines of blue light along the frame, and the wheels looked like they belonged on a prototype motorcycle, not a medical device. "You did this?" Frank asked, eyes darting between the chair and Clara. She stopped beside him, smiling warmly. "We upgraded your design. All we did was build on your foundation." Frank rubbed the back of his neck. "All I did was fix a busted wheel." "No," Clara said, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You saw the need. You didn't wait for a form, a payment, or permission. You just acted. That's the heart of all good engineering." Frank looked down at Eli, who was now demonstrating how his chair could pivot on a dime and tilt without tipping over. "I just didn't want him to hurt himself." "And now," Clara said, "he won't, because of you." Eli rolled back and beamed up at them. "It even has hover mode now. Want to see?" Frank's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Clara laughed. "We're still in testing, but yes, the next prototype has short-range lift capability for uneven terrain, curbs, maybe even stairs." Frank stared in awe. "You're not just fixing mobility, you're rewriting it." Clara looked at him with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite a challenge. It was an invitation. "Come work with us," she said. "You know machines. You know people. You know how to care. That's rarer than tech." Frank hesitated, overwhelmed. His heart beat faster than it had in years. "I wouldn't know where to start." "You already did," Clara said. The night after the reunion, Clara sat alone in her motel room, watching the local news cycle a replay of their arrival at the airstrip. She looked tired, but not from traveling, from holding in years of dreams. Earlier, she'd walked Eli around the town. They'd passed the old hardware store, the post office, and a tiny library where she used to check out engineering manuals in her teens. Millbridge hadn't changed much. That made it the perfect place to remember where things began. Eli had wanted to visit the diner. He asked about Skyhawk milkshakes, something he claimed existed in the comic. She promised to make one with extra whipped cream. But as the town buzzed with the miracle of the wheelchair and the mystery of the woman behind the jet, Clara focused on something quieter, the man who never asked to be part of any of it. Frank Turner, he didn't just fix a chair, he'd built something more meaningful, a moment of dignity. That kind of help didn't come from engineers or executives. It came from people who gave when they didn't have to, who repaired what they didn't break. After dinner, Clara drove back to his garage. The sun was setting, casting orange light through the dusty windows. The sign out front, Turner's Auto and Tire, looked like a relic from another era. But inside, she saw sketches, dozens of them, hover systems, reinforced struts, foldable designs for terrain-changing wheels. They were rough, hand-drawn, but visionary. She recognized one drawing. It matched a concept they'd built weeks ago at ADA, a prototype her team couldn't solve until now. And Frank had sketched it from instinct. He wasn't just a good mechanic, he was a savant. Clara stood there for a long time, tracing the pencil lines with her eyes, not daring to touch. When Frank stepped in from the back room, oil on his hands and surprise on his face, she simply said, "I wasn't looking for an engineer." Frank blinked. "No?" She shook her head. "I was looking for you." Frank wasn't the kind of man who looked for praise. He'd always believed that good work spoke for itself, and if it didn't, well, that was fine too. He had his shop, his tools, his peace. Recognition wasn't something he craved. So when Clara returned to the garage the next day, not with a clipboard or a blueprint, but with tears in her eyes and a look of utter sincerity, he didn't know how to react. She didn't start with words. She simply walked in, placed a small black case on the counter, and opened it slowly. Inside was a polished brass plaque, engraved with precision, presented to Frank Turner, in recognition of uncommon kindness, intuitive engineering, and life-changing compassion. ADO Initiative, Phase 2, Honorary Founder. Frank stared at it, silent. Clara placed her hand on the case. There are very few people in this world who act without expecting something in return, even fewer who do it for someone they don't know. Frank scratched at his beard. "It was just a chair, a busted wheel." "No," Clara said, stepping closer, voice low but firm. "It was more than that. You saw my son struggling and you gave him his dignity back. You saw him, not a broken machine, not a problem to fix, a boy." Frank cleared his throat, uneasy under the weight of her gratitude. "You know, I've fixed a lot of things for folks. Don't always get a plaque for it." Clara laughed, a little teary-eyed. "True, but this one's special, because your repair didn't just help my son, it helped me." Frank looked at her, confused. She continued, "Eli's had a lot of setbacks, and I've had to be strong for both of us. But seeing him light up like that, seeing him fly down the street spinning with joy, I hadn't seen that kind of smile since he was a toddler. I needed to see that again. You reminded me why I fight so hard to build what I build." Frank swallowed. "Well, you're welcome. But I really don't need—" "I know you don't," Clara interrupted gently. "But that's why you deserve it." She closed the case and slid it toward him. Let this remind you that even the smallest repair can change the trajectory of a life. Frank stood there, the weight of her words sinking in slowly. For years he'd worked alone, believing his skills were good for keeping cars running and folks safe on the road. He never imagined those same hands could build freedom, dignity, hope. He picked up the plaque and turned it over in his hands. Guess this means I'm part of something bigger now, huh? Clara smiled. You always were. The next morning the garage was quieter than usual. Clara arrived early, Eli still fast asleep back at the motel. Frank had been expecting her. He had coffee brewing and a fresh oil rag tucked into his back pocket. But today wasn't about bolts and gears. Clara stepped in wearing a dark navy blazer over a simple white shirt, her usual flight suit exchanged for something more formal. She looked less like a pilot and more like an executive, and in a way, she was both. I want to offer you a job, she said without preamble. Frank blinked, then leaned against his workbench. A job? Clara nodded, already setting down a thin folder labeled a DA Initiative, Civilian Integration Program. I've already spoken to our leadership team. We're ready to fast-track you through onboarding, consultant status to start, then senior engineer, remote options, or in-lab, your choice. Frank opened the folder. It was full of official-looking documents, technical outlines, pay tiers, housing stipends, and a non-disclosure agreement thicker than a phone book. I appreciate it, he said slowly, but I don't have a degree. No certifications. Never been part of a think tank. Clara sat on a stool across from him. You don't need a degree to see what others can't. You saw a better future in Eli's broken chair. You improved it in ways my whole team couldn't figure out until they saw your sketches. Frank rubbed his hands together, still hesitant. This shop is my life. It's not much, but it's mine. We're not asking you to abandon it, Clara said. We're asking you to expand it. Your ideas don't belong in a dusty garage. They belong in labs, in prototypes, in production. He looked up at her, torn. I'm just not sure I fit into a place like that. Clara leaned forward, her voice quiet but resolute. The people who change the world are never the ones who think they belong. They're the ones who build something when no one else will. That's you. Frank stared at the contract again. He could already imagine the headlines. Mechanic joins aerospace project. It sounded absurd. But then he thought of Eli, of the look on that boy's face, on the way he'd spun circles in that silver frame, arms thrown out like wings, of the kids out there just like him, waiting, and for the first time he saw something different in the shop's dusty corners, a runway. He set the contract down. All right, he said, let's do it, but I get to keep my name in my garage. Clara grinned. Deal. They shook hands, greased meeting aerospace, and in that moment the past and future agreed to build something together. Millbridge wasn't used to making headlines outside its county, much less national news, but over the next few days the town was swept into a whirlwind it hadn't seen since its founding. Local newspapers had to reprint extra copies. TV trucks parked outside Ruth's Cafe, cords snaking across sidewalks. The airstrip, long forgotten and mostly abandoned, was suddenly a secured site patrolled by Clara's company personnel in slick black uniforms and minimalist logo jackets. Drones buzzed overhead. Reporters camped outside Frank's garage. And Frank? he still opened the shop every morning at 7 a.m. To the people of Millbridge, he was still just Frank Turner, the guy who rotated your tires, tuned your truck, and never overcharged you. But now whispers followed him into the grocery store, and parents nudged their kids to wave at him in the post office. The diner even added a new breakfast combo to the menu. The Turner Special, 2 eggs, toast, and a side of something humble. What surprised Frank the most, though, wasn't the attention. It was the support. People dropped off food, thank you cards, even old tools they thought he might use on his top-secret space project, EI, as one note called it. Kids rode past on their bikes yelling, "Make us fly, Frank." A handmade banner was strung across Main Street. "Our hero wears grease, not a cape." He read it, smiled, and kept walking. Clara, meanwhile, held a quiet presence in town. She politely declined most interviews, choosing instead to meet with local officials and visit schools to talk about STEM education and the potential of aerospace innovations in rural communities. She and Frank met each evening to discuss sketches, test ideas, and plan the next steps. They used the garage's back room as a makeshift design lab. While the town saw a simple man becoming a legend, Frank just saw work to be done, lives to be changed. One afternoon, Clara hosted a private demonstration at the airstrip for the town council. She showcased a new hover assist wheelchair built using a blend of Frank's mechanical intuition and her team's AI stabilization tech. Eli zipped across the tarmac like a glider on wheels. The crowd gasped. A councilwoman wiped a tear from her cheek. "You're not just giving kids mobility," she said. "You're giving them freedom." Frank stood off to the side, awkwardly clutching a wrench like a microphone. That night he sat on the steps of the garage, the quiet town glowing under the street lamps. Clara joined him, and they both stared up at the stars. "This whole place feels different," he said. "It is," she replied. "You changed it." He turned to her. "You think we're really going to make a difference out there?" Clara smiled. "We already have." Years earlier, in a cramped city apartment surrounded by soldering tools and stacks of engineering textbooks, Clara had nearly quit. It was 2 a.m., and Eli, still a toddler, had just fallen asleep after a rough night of breathing treatments and pain in his legs. The apartment was dark except for the dim glow of her laptop screen and the blinking cursor on a blank CAD design. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, spiritually. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. The financial pressure was brutal. She had a part-time job fixing drones in a startup warehouse, did online tutoring late at night, and still couldn't afford half the therapy equipment Eli needed. Grants were hard to come by for someone without a PhD or political connections. The industry was stacked with gatekeepers, and she didn't have the key. But she had one thing: resolve. She remembered sitting on the apartment floor, cradling Eli as he slept. His breath was shallow, but he looked peaceful. In that silence, she had whispered, "I will not stop. I will break the mold. I will build you wings." Clara returned to her laptop and started sketching. Not the official projects, those belonged to the company. These were hers. Diagrams for lightweight propulsion, concepts for spinal support exosuits, designs for modular wheel systems. Nothing anyone asked her to do, but everything she needed to do. Her nights blurred into years. She worked her way into top-secret defense programs using every bit of access to learn materials, science, compact energy systems, neural feedback loops, anything that could be used to create true mobility without limits. By day, she built machines of war, but by night, she built hope. And every time she almost gave up, she'd see Eli in the hallway, leaning against the wall, smiling at her through the ache in his legs. That smile always pulled her back in. Now, watching him fly across the Millbridge airstrip, in a chair that was part Frank, part Clara, and all miracle, she knew every second of that sacrifice had been worth it. After a week of collaboration, curiosity finally got the better of Frank. He'd seen the jet up close, watched it take off and land, even heard it hum when idle, but he hadn't been inside. Clara had never pressed him. She knew trust couldn't be rushed. But one afternoon, as they wrapped up a long brainstorming session in the garage, Clara tossed him the keys to the hangar. "You ready to see how it really works?" Frank caught the keys, smirked. "You sure you want a grease monkey messing with your spaceship?" Clara grinned. "You're not just a mechanic anymore." They drove to the airstrip in silence. The guards nodded them through the checkpoint. Frank marveled at how quickly the place had changed. Once a forgotten strip of pavement, now a mini-tech hub humming with quiet innovation. The jet stood gleaming in the center of the hangar, its body still as a shark mid-hunt. Clara walked ahead, opened the side panel with a biometric scanner, and gestured for Frank to step inside. He hesitated, then he climbed in. The cockpit was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Touchscreen panels curved around the pilot's seat. The entire interior pulsed softly with light, reactive to movement. A small hovering display activated as he sat down, projecting a holographic interface. Frank whistled. "This ain't no fighter jet." Clara smiled from the co-pilot seat. This one's for rescue. High speed, low altitude, built for emergencies. Medevac, supply drops. The ADA version will be modular, interchangeable depending on needs." Frank touched a control panel. It shifted under his fingers, adapting. "Feels like a living thing." Clara nodded. "That's the idea. Machines that respond, not just obey." He leaned back, the seat adjusting to his frame. "You want me to help build more of these?" "No," she said. "I want you to help build the next one." Frank looked at her, mind reeling. He hadn't flown in anything since a Cessna in '94. But now, sitting in the cockpit of the future, something inside him clicked. "Let's take it for a spin," he said. Clara grinned. "I thought you'd never ask." The jet's engines cooled as the hangar doors closed behind them. Frank stepped down the ramp, legs a little shaky, not from nerves but from awe. He'd flown before, sure, but never like that. Clara walked beside him, quiet at first. She always gave people a moment after their first flight in her prototype. It had a way of silencing even the most talkative minds. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "That thing doesn't fly, it glides. It's like flying a thought." Clara chuckled. "That's the goal." They made their way toward a small office tucked into the corner of the hangar. Inside was a whiteboard filled with sketches, formulas, and diagrams. A table sat beneath it with several small models. Wheelchairs, walkers, even arm braces, all in varying stages of prototyping. Frank glanced around. "This your real workshop?" "It's where I let my mind go," she said. "Everything here? It's not military, it's mission." Frank raised an eyebrow. Clara turned serious. My official work is still with defense contracts. The government funds a lot of ADA's research. But this branch, what we're building together, it's going to be public. Public? She nodded. We're working toward open access mobility tech, designs anyone can download, parts they can print, systems they can build at home, even in rural towns like this. Frank blinked. You want to give this stuff away? Yes, she said without hesitation, because for millions of people around the world, mobility is the difference between surviving and living, and it shouldn't be locked behind patents and price tags. Frank walked over to a model, one of the hoverwheel systems he'd originally sketched. It was now scaled, functional, refined. You think they'll let you do that? He asked. I think they'll try to stop me, she replied. But I'm not asking for permission. He studied her for a moment. There was steel in her voice, but not arrogance, conviction. Clara wasn't doing this for fame or profit. She was doing it because she'd promised a little boy something the world told her was impossible. And now she was keeping that promise with every fiber of her being. Frank stepped back. You've got a hell of a mission. Clara smiled. Not just mine anymore. A week later, Frank was suited up in a lightweight pilot shell, less armor, more interface. The crew had modified the cockpit to fit dual controls. Today, he wasn't just along for the ride. He was flying. Clara sat beside him, giving quiet instructions as they ran through the checklist. Throttle at 50, pressurized cabin locked, adjust hover vectoring to manual. Frank followed along, hands surprisingly steady. You good? Clara asked. He nodded, looking at the airstrip stretching before them. Let's see what this baby can do. The engines hummed to life. Softer than any he'd heard, yet powerful. The jet lifted gently, its wheels barely touching the ground before it began to rise. Frank tilted the yoke, adjusted the pitch, and felt the jet respond like an extension of his body. They soared, not high, not fast, just right. They flew over Millbridge, past the river, above the schoolyard where kids pointed up in excitement. The town looked smaller from here, but somehow it felt bigger, fuller. Frank looked over at Clara. I'm flying. She smiled. You're guiding. Big difference. They banked left, gliding along the tree line. Clara activated a test sequence. Below them, a display showed sensor data. Altitude, wind resistance, fuel cell output, everything was stable. Then Clara tapped another button. Suddenly the screens changed, now showing a simulated interface for a wheelchair pilot module. Frank gasped. You integrated it. We did, she said. Eli will be able to use this very soon. The system adapts to eye movement and head tilt. No hands required. Full 3D flight control. He won't just ride, he'll fly. Frank was silent, moved in a way he couldn't put into words. This wasn't just technology, it was liberation. They landed 20 minutes later. The crew applauded. Frank stepped out with a grin stretched so wide it hurt. I haven't felt like that since I first rode a bike, he said. With the training wheels off. Clara nodded. That's what we're building. Flight. Without the need to be carried. The next morning, Frank sat at his workbench long before sunrise, sketching like a man possessed. His mind was buzzing, not with jet engines, but with wheels. Clara's systems were state-of-the-art. Her jet was the future. But Frank saw something she didn't yet, a bridge, a way to connect the technology of tomorrow with the materials and knowledge of today. something anyone could build. He started with the chassis, a modular design, pieces that could snap together like puzzle blocks, easily replaced when damaged. Next came the motor assembly, a hybrid system that used small energy cells combined with hand-powered torque, efficient, accessible, rechargeable with solar. Then the interface, inspired by Clara's neural link models but simplified, controlled via touch, head movement, or even whistle commands. No expensive sensors, just clever mechanics and adaptive code. He added storage space for tools, school supplies, and one small hidden panel, because every kid deserves a secret compartment. By 10 a.m., he had something new, the Liberty Frame. He brought the designs to Clara, unsure of how she'd react. After all, this wasn't high-tech, it wasn't shiny, but it was real. She studied the diagrams, eyes widening with every page. "You built this for kids like Eli?" Frank nodded. "Not just for him. For all the kids who'll never see a lab, who live in towns like mine, who can't afford to wait for funding." Clara looked up, her expression one of deep respect. "You didn't invent a wheelchair, Frank. You invented independence." They spent the rest of the day refining the design together. By nightfall, it had a name, a mission, and a future. And the mechanic who'd once thought he was done dreaming had just invented something that might change the world again. By now, the jet was no longer a mystery, and Frank Turner was no longer just a mechanic. The ADA initiative had begun quietly bringing in more personnel, engineers, developers, roboticists, all drawn to the prototype lab now operating out of a converted hangar near the edge of Millbridge. But instead of taking over, they adapted. Clara made it clear from the start. Frank's voice held equal weight. That meant decisions weren't made in boardrooms. They were made in Frank's garage, usually with his sleeves rolled up, a socket wrench in one hand and a whiteboard marker in the other. One morning, as Frank worked on the Liberty Frame, a young engineer named Tanya joined him. Fresh out of MIT, she specialized in adaptive coding for mobility devices. "Clara says your rig could be our breakthrough," she said. Frank didn't look up from his sketch pad. "It's not fancy, but it works," Tanya replied. "That's what matters." She knelt beside him, studying the half-built prototype. "You mind if I try integrating some AI fail-safe logic? It could auto-correct balance during uneven surfaces." "Just keep it simple," Frank said. "We're building this for folks who've never even heard of AI." "Got it," she smiled. "Simple is smart." Within days, a collaboration began. Engineers added modular electronics to Frank's analog brilliance. Developers wrote lightweight firmware that could be updated over Wi-Fi or even a USB stick. Medical consultants suggested ergonomic tweaks. Frank, in turn, refined the design to keep it buildable in basic workshops. No expensive parts, no special licenses, just tools, passion, and care. What amazed everyone was how well it worked. Clara watched it unfold with pride. It was a perfect storm of innovation, where technology met human instinct, where high-tech met heart. In one meeting, she addressed the team. "We're not just building equipment, we're building empowerment. And none of this would exist without the man who saw a broken wheel and decided to fix the whole road." Frank turned red and muttered something about "just doing my job," but the room gave him a standing ovation anyway. They weren't just collaborators now. They were co-pilots in a mission that had only just taken off. Despite all the progress, Frank never abandoned his garage. Each morning he opened Turner's Auto and Tire like clockwork. Customers still brought in busted mufflers and misfiring engines. He'd joke with them, fix what needed fixing, and send them off with a nod and a promise. If it rattles again, you know where to find me. But something had shifted. The back wall of the garage now held a drafting table, surrounded by new shelving, digital tools, and 3D printed parts. It looked more like a hybrid of a repair shop and an inventor's lab. Every night, after the town quieted and the engineers packed up, Frank would return to that corner, his little sanctuary of design. He kept a folder labeled "What Ifs." Inside were sketches that hadn't been approved yet, concepts too raw, too wild, solar walkers, folding mini gliders for wheelchair users, compact assistive drones that could carry groceries or tools. He didn't show them to anyone yet. They were his playground, his hope pile. One evening, Clara dropped by unannounced. She stood at the door of the garage, watching as Frank tinkered with a gyroscope prototype. "Have you ever taken a break?" she asked. Frank looked up, smiling. "This is my break." Clara walked over, picking up one of the "What If" sketches. "This one, is that a personal skylift pod?" "More like a floating stool," Frank said, "for caregivers, so they don't have to bend all day." Clara whistled. "Smart." She sat on the bench beside him. "Have you ever thought about opening a real lab? Full staff, full budget?" "I've got all I need right here," Frank said, gesturing to the garage. Clara didn't argue. She understood now that Frank didn't build things for glory. He built them because people needed them, because they mattered. And if that kind of genius chose to stay grounded in a dusty garage, surrounded by oily rags and toolboxes, then that garage had just become one of the most important labs in the world. One sunny afternoon, Millbridge gathered in the town square for what was supposed to be a modest thank you picnic. But by the time noon rolled around, it had transformed into something much more. A small stage was set up near the gazebo. Kids wore "Fly Like Eli" t-shirts. Local businesses offered free drinks and snacks. Someone even made jet-shaped cookies with blue icing. The mayor stood at the podium, nervously clutching his speech. Frank stood off to the side in his best button-up shirt, completely out of his element. When the mayor began speaking, the town hushed. Today we honor not just the incredible technology brought to us by Clara Rivera and her team, but the spirit of this community, the heart of a man who reminded us all that great things come from small beginnings. Applause, whistles, cheers. Frank awkwardly waved as the mayor gestured for him to step forward. Clara gave him a nudge. "You built this." Frank cleared his throat and stepped up to the mic. He looked out over a sea of familiar faces, neighbors, friends, former classmates, and he said the only thing that felt honest: "I fixed a wheelchair." The crowd laughed softly. He smiled. "That's all I did. One wheel, one bolt, one good deed." He paused. "But sometimes one small thing can start a big thing, and that's what you all are, a big thing, a town that lifts people up, that gives a damn. So if I did anything special, it's only because I come from here." Silence, then wild applause. That evening after the picnic, the town did something that took Frank's breath away. They unveiled a new sign at the entrance to Millbridge: "Welcome to Millbridge, home of innovation, kindness, and flight." and just below it, in honor of Frank Turner, the man who gave a boy his wings. Frank stood there long after everyone else left, staring at the sign, trying to believe it was real. And for once, he let himself feel proud. Long after the town picnic ended and the cookie crumbs were swept away, something lingered in Millbridge, something deeper than excitement. A legacy was forming. It wasn't just about Frank anymore. It wasn't even just about Eli. Frank's small act of kindness had grown roots, and those roots were sprouting everywhere. At the school, teachers were adding hands-on STEM projects inspired by the Liberty Frame. The local library had created a Frank Turner Innovation Corner, stocked with books about mechanics, engineering, and design thinking. And kids, especially the ones who didn't see themselves as smart or techie, started bringing in their own inventions. Paper wings, makeshift wheels, solar-powered toy cars. Frank visited the library once a week to help them out. He didn't lecture, he just listened, guided, encouraged. You don't need to be a genius, he told them. You just need to be curious and kind. At the garage, things changed too. Clara arranged for a second building to be installed on the lot, an official ADA-supported annex, equipped with 3D printers, computer workstations, and testing bays. But Frank still insisted on keeping his old shop. Some things, he said, should smell like oil and sweat. People from out of town began visiting. Journalists, engineers, even mobility advocates from Europe and South America. They didn't come to see a corporate HQ or a sterile lab. They came to see Frank, to see the town that had quietly created something revolutionary. And every time someone asked, "What made you do it?" Frank gave the same answer. "The wheel was broken. I had the tools." One day, Clara handed him a padded envelope. Inside was a letter from a woman in Ohio. Her son had spina bifida, and after seeing Eli's story online, they downloaded the Liberty Frame blueprints and used a local makerspace to build one. The note read, "You didn't just fix a wheelchair, you fixed our hope. Thank you." Frank folded the letter slowly, then placed it in a wooden box on a shelf in his shop. The box was almost full now. Dozens of letters from families, students, veterans, teachers. He never sought recognition, but he couldn't deny it anymore. His kindness had become a legacy. The lab built next to Frank's garage was modest by Silicon Valley standards, but to Millbridge, it was the future. A long rectangular building with solar panels on the roof and wide glass windows that revealed rows of engineers working alongside apprentices from the local high school. Frank had fought to keep it open to the public. "We're not hiding secrets," he told Clara. "We're building solutions." The lab had a name now, the Hope Forge. It wasn't officially ADA, nor was it government property. It was a hybrid, part grassroots, part think tank, all heart. Clara had pulled strings, written grant proposals, even dipped into her own savings to make it real. Inside, magic happened daily. Students and engineers worked side by side to build adaptive tools for people with cerebral palsy. A retired machinist taught visitors how to fabricate low-cost prosthetics using recycled metals. Tanya, the young MIT engineer, hosted a bi-weekly hackathon called Wings and Wrenches, where people tried to solve everyday mobility problems in under 48 hours. But the crown jewel remained the Liberty Frame. It had gone through 6 iterations now, lighter, faster, easier to build. Every time they made an improvement, they posted the updates online under an open license. The downloads numbered in the tens of thousands. And then came the big moment. A major humanitarian nonprofit contacted Clara about distributing Liberty frames to underserved areas globally. The plan: partner with local workshops to fabricate them using community labor and repurposed materials. When Clara told Frank the news, he just stared for a long moment before quietly saying, "We're going to change the world from this garage?" She smiled. "We already are." But the Hope Forge wasn't just about output, it was about inviting people in. They hosted open days where veterans, disabled workers, and children with limited mobility came to try the new tech. No sales pitch, no judgment, just a space where the question was always, "What do you need?" Because that's what Frank had asked Eli all those months ago. Now the world was learning to ask it too. The sun was just beginning to rise when Eli rolled onto the tarmac at the airstrip. He was quiet, more contemplative than usual. Clara walked beside him, her hands in her jacket pockets. Frank trailed behind, carrying a box of tools just in case. "Big day," Clara said softly. Eli nodded. "I've been waiting for this." Parked ahead of them was a compact two-seater pod jet, painted cobalt and silver with Skyhawk decals custom designed by Eli himself. It was more than a plane. It was a personal lifter, specifically adapted for users with mobility challenges. It had taken months of development, hundreds of iterations, and countless hours of testing. And today, Eli was going to fly it. He rolled to the edge of the jet's entry platform and paused. "Do you think I'll mess up?" Clara knelt beside him. "Messing up is part of flying. That's why we have parachutes and second chances." Frank chuckled. "That thing's smarter than most pilots I've met. It'll carry you if you falter." Eli smiled, but it was tight with nerves. Still, he rolled forward. A robotic lift carried him gently into the cockpit. The interior adjusted automatically to his posture. His wheelchair remained integrated behind him, locked in place. He placed his hands on the control panel. The neural interface is engaged. He could feel it. A hum of possibility. Clara's voice came through his earpiece. "We're here. We believe in you." Frank added, "Go light up that sky, Skyhawk." The pod lifted, slowly at first, then with more confidence as Eli leaned forward, mentally syncing with the system. He climbed higher, leaving the tarmac, then the rooftops, then the trees. The sun hit the top of the cockpit canopy and painted the entire pod in gold. And from below, Frank and Clara watched as a boy who once struggled to cross the street soared across the sky. He wasn't just flying, he was free. Weeks passed. Eli's successful test flights spread across the internet like wildfire. First, a few niche mobility advocacy blogs picked it up. Then a viral YouTube clip. Then came the interviews, headlines, and even a short feature on a national morning show. But Clara, Frank, and the ADA initiative weren't interested in fame. They were focused on the next goal, making the jet accessible to more than just Eli. The design, officially named the Skylift 1, had been Clara's dream since the earliest days of Project ADA. It wasn't a fighter nor a luxury aircraft. It was a mobility lifter built specifically to give flight to those who had been grounded far too long, not metaphorically but literally. "Let's be honest," Clara told a panel at a tech conference. "Mobility isn't just about wheelchairs. It's about access. And for too long, we've accepted the ground as the limit. I refuse that." Frank had spent the last month refining Skylift 1's frame for manufacturability. He simplified components, reduced reliance on proprietary parts, and even figured out a way for the pod to disassemble for easier shipping. Tanya and her software team cracked the final problem: how to build an AI-assisted interface that didn't require implants or advanced sensors. Their secret: intention mapping. Using subtle head movements, pressure sensitivity, and eye tracking via a low-cost camera, they'd made it possible to control the pod with astonishing accuracy. No training required. Soon, partners came knocking. Humanitarian organizations, educational institutions, even aerospace startups who wanted to license the tech for rural rescue, vertical cargo drops, or mountain transport. Clara made one thing clear in every meeting: we're not selling a product, we're offering permission. The permission to fly, to imagine, to build. If you're here to profit, walk away. If you're here to change lives, let's talk. Together, Clara and Frank published a public white paper, Jet for the People, a blueprint for inclusive flight. It outlined the core principles of Skylift, detailed construction specs, and gave away the AI controller software under an open-source license. Within a month, makerspaces in 5 countries were already attempting their first builds. Skylift was no longer a prototype. It was a movement. Millbridge wasn't used to planning large events, but the mayor and half the town's residents insisted, "We've got to celebrate the jet that started here." The result? A weekend festival titled Wings Over Millbridge. Banners lined the streets. The school painted murals of Eli soaring above the town. Main Street was closed off for music, food, games, and booths from tech teams, disability rights groups, and local craftspeople who had all contributed in some way to the Liberty Frame, or Skylift. Frank didn't want a parade. He got one anyway. On the second day, the town gathered in front of the courthouse, where the mayor unveiled a sculpture, a metallic, stylized version of the Liberty Frame, wheels flaring out like wings, rising from a concrete base with the inscription, "One small fix, one giant flight," dedicated to Frank Turner and all those who repair with love. Frank uncharacteristically choked up, accepted a key to the city, but he didn't give a long speech. Just 7 words: "We built this together. Let's keep going." Later that evening, the airstrip became the centerpiece of the celebration. Clara's team had coordinated a short air show featuring several ADA prototypes, drones, lifters, and modified wheelchairs with assistive hover tech. The finale, Skylift 1, flown by Eli himself. The entire town stood breathless as the boy lifted into the evening sky, the sunset casting him in brilliant shades of gold and fire. The sound wasn't just awe, it was hope. Eli's heart raced as the Skylift control pod hummed to life beneath his hands. He had practiced this flight a dozen times. He'd sat in simulators, memorized commands, learned how to tilt his head just right to bank left, to look up and climb, to focus on a single dot to steady himself. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. Below him, Millbridge glowed like a beacon. Soft porch lights, the street fair still bustling, fireworks set to go off after his return. But up here, it was just him. Him and the sky. The jet responded like it had a soul. Every thought moved through his fingers and head, becoming action. He banked gently over the schoolyard, where kids waved foam gliders. He dipped lower over Main Street, careful and steady, then ascended in a spiral, smoke trailing from his wingtips in streams of blue. The headset chirped, Frank's voice came through the comms. "How's it feeling, Skyhawk?" Eli grinned. "Feels like I've had wings all along." Clara's voice followed. "You're doing great, kiddo. Time to bring it in for the big finish." "Copy that." He arced once more, high above the crowd, then eased the pod down in a gentle hover. Slow, elegant, powerful. He touched down right on the red circle painted in the center of the airstrip. The silence that followed was total. Then came the cheers, louder than anything he'd ever heard, louder than engines, louder than dreams, louder than fear. Clara sprinted to him first, tears streaking her cheeks, hugging him so tightly the headset slipped sideways. Frank stood behind her, proud and still, like a man watching a tree he once planted finally reach the clouds. Eli looked up at the crowd and raised his arms. He wasn't seated, he was soaring. Long after the celebration faded and the cheering stopped, people kept asking the same question. How did all this start? The story always came back to that one moment, simple, quiet, and almost too small to notice. Frank Turner, the local mechanic, had been sipping his morning coffee when he saw a young boy struggling with a broken wheelchair on the sidewalk. No cameras, no fanfare, just a wheel that wouldn't turn right and a man who couldn't walk past that kind of problem. That moment, that single act had bloomed into wings. Reporters still wanted to call it a miracle. Tech CEOs tried to spin it into a trend. Some even suggested the government step in and commercialize the Skylift program. But Clara always shook her head. "Number, you can't mass-produce kindness." The truth was, the Liberty Frame, Skylift, and the Hope Forge didn't grow out of a billion-dollar initiative. They grew from a choice to care, to act, to say yes when it would have been easier to look away. Frank never planned to change the world. But in that moment when Eli's wheel faltered and he rolled up beside him with nothing but tools in hand and a heart full of decency, he did. That's the funny thing about kindness. It echoes. It ripples outward, passing from one life to another, collecting force and momentum until one small fix becomes a revolution. Frank didn't consider himself a hero. He never wore a cape. His uniform was grease-stained denim and a faded ball cap. But the world didn't need another caped crusader. It needed a man who saw something broken and made it better. And as the news continued to spread, as more people downloaded the blueprints, as more children like Eli lifted off in machines they never dreamed they'd touch, everyone who encountered the story was reminded of the same message. One small kindness can build 1,000 wings. It began with a wheel, but the story behind it stretched far longer. As Frank sat on the steps of his garage one quiet evening, watching the orange sun dip behind the pines, a wave of memory passed through him. Flash. Young Clara in her cramped apartment, soldering circuit boards while Eli slept next to her. She was tired, determined, working in silence for a future she didn't yet believe the world would let her reach. Flash. Eli, age 5, trying to keep up with kids at school, pushing through mud in a wheelchair that didn't turn. His mother was kneeling beside him, whispering, "One day we'll give you wings." Flash. Frank, 10 years earlier, holding a photo of his late wife in his pocket, deciding to keep the shop open after almost closing for good, fixing a neighbor's old bicycle without charging them, just because they couldn't afford it. Flash. The day he saw Eli outside the shop, the hesitation in the boy's eyes, the soft way he said, "I don't have money." And Frank replied, "Didn't ask for any." Flash. The first time Eli rolled in the improved chair, beaming like he had a secret no one else could see. Flash. Clara placed the black folder in his hands, offering him not a job, but a purpose. Flash. The first prototype, the laboratory, the laughter, the learning. Flash. Eli's first flight. A soft voice broke his thoughts. "Are you still thinking about that wheel?" Clara asked, walking up with 2 mugs of coffee. Frank took one and smiled. "I think about how something so small became something this big." Clara sat beside him. "You know why?" "Why?" "Because we didn't let it stay small." They clinked mugs and drank in the quiet. Behind them, inside the workshop, new blueprints were being drafted. New teams were brainstorming ideas. A whole generation of thinkers and doers had been inspired by that moment on the sidewalk. Frank didn't see a flash this time. He saw the future, wide open, full of light, and ready to fly. Eli sat alone in the cockpit of the Skylift 2, sleeker, faster, more intuitive than even the original. It was still undergoing software updates, but he was allowed to run local simulations for training. As he navigated the virtual flight over digital cityscapes, his eyes sparkled with calm confidence. This was no longer new. It was his. In the simulation, buildings shrank beneath him. He maneuvered around towers, wove between power lines, and touched down on moving platforms. Every move was precise, instinctive. He was no longer the boy people pitied. He was the boy with wings. His dream, once a whisper in the dark, was now a thunder in the sky. The cockpit display blinked. Simulation complete. Performance 99.8%. Flight ready. Eli leaned back and let out a slow breath. Clara entered from the rear hangar door, watching him with pride. "Are you ready for the next level?" she asked. Eli turned. "I've got an idea." She raised a brow. "Oh?" He held up a tablet filled with sketches, personal hover boots, modular flying crutches, stairless city navigation hubs. "Everyone should fly," he said. "Not just me." Clara laughed gently, tears misting her eyes. "You're becoming just like Frank." "No," Eli grinned. "I'm becoming like me." It was early evening when the town of Millbridge gathered for what had become a new tradition, a yearly event called Flight Day. Part celebration, part demonstration, part reminder of how far they had come since the day one boy struggled with a broken wheel. The airstrip had been transformed into a community hub. Food trucks lined the edges. Portable stages hosted school choirs and local musicians. Engineers from the Hope Forge gave mini-talks on future tech. But everyone's eyes were on the sky, waiting. Frank stood at the front of the crowd, next to Clara, Eli, and a handful of students preparing for their first hoverchair trials. He had one hand in his pocket, the other holding a folded-up piece of paper, a letter from a young girl in Kenya who'd built her own Liberty frame from scrap parts. "You ever think we'd come this far?" Clara asked. Frank didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the horizon. Then softly, "Sometimes I think we're just getting started." The speakers crackled. A voice came over the sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages, please direct your attention to the skies as Eli Rivera, the world's first adaptive flight pilot, prepares for the final pass." Eli's skylift hummed to life above the trees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows and turning the sky into a canvas of crimson and amber. The jet gleamed as it rose, elegant and confident. He banked once, then twice, flying low over the field before climbing in a spiral and leveling out in a glide that passed directly over the crowd. As he flew, smaller hover drones released bursts of biodegradable confetti that sparkled like stardust. The people below erupted into cheers. Frank smiled, a quiet, satisfied smile. Clara's hand rested lightly on his shoulder. "You gave him the first push." He looked at her. "You gave him the sky." "No," she said, eyes glistening. "We gave him wings." A final arc traced the setting sun, and as the sky lift turned westward, its silhouette etched against the gold-tinged clouds, a quiet settled over Millbridge. It wasn't just a boy in a jet. It wasn't just a mechanic, a mother, or a town. It was a reminder that one small kindness, one bolt, one fix, one act of faith could set the course for a miracle. As the final flare of light burst in the sky, and the crowd clapped one last time, Frank exhaled and looked upward. And for a moment it was as if the whole world was held aloft, not by engines, not by wings, but by hope.